When I was very young, early 70s, I was in the back of a car with my mother. She used to go and regularly see her parents in Langley. And as we were driving through Windsor, there were all these people walking along by the side of the road with long hair, with backpacks on, and it was Windsor Free Festival. And I remember turning to my mother and saying, "Who are all these people?" And she said, "Oh, those are hippies." I remember being fascinated by it, thinking, well, what's all that about?
This is Season 2 of the Corruption Diaries, a podcast from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Naomi Fowler. In the previous episode, veteran tax justice campaigner Richard Allen had dropped out of traditional education and he wasn't sure what to do with his life. But in 1982, there he was, queuing outside a Grateful Dead concert.
I had never been to see a band before. I'd never been to a rock concert. I had no understanding of the Grateful Dead's history, what they were about. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, look, they're playing in London." When we were queuing outside, there were lots of Americans, because they would follow them all over the place. They carried around with them a kind of a microcosm of the 60s. And it was exactly the sort of people that I had started to show an interest in, the kind of hippies, for want of a better word.
He stepped inside and he finally realised what had been missing in his life.
The ceiling of the venue is like a sky covered in stars that twinkle, and there's palm trees either side of the stage. And the floor slopes down to the front of the stage, so you get an incredible view. It was like a revelation, really. They play as if it's a giant party. They improvise. It was just music. I mean, that's all it was about. You never know what songs they're going to play. Each version of each song they play is different. They will merge one song into another. When you go to a Grateful Dead concert, you're swept into this singular experience that everyone's involved in. And people that you don't even know are your friends. People were just chatting to me, handing me drinks, total strangers, as if I'd known them for years. So it was a collective experience. I just came out of that concert a completely different person, I would say. The possibilities of what music could be were just shown to me at that concert, and from that moment on my interest was going to see bands, buying music. I became quite obsessive about it, and going to concerts and festivals, and I spent the next 10 years constantly going to gigs. I had no interest in the mainstream music. Everything sounded the same. Music in the 60s and 70s was part of a cultural movement. You saw more and more people experimenting with a kind of, I guess you call it, bohemian lifestyle. So I was attracted to that, probably because I just didn't like what was being presented to me as an option. Get a job, go to work, earn some money, buy a house, all those things just seemed so boring in comparison to going to the free festival. When I think of the 80s, I think of crass in every respect. It was, everyone goes, "Oh, wasn't it great? Everyone's earning huge amounts of money and drinking champagne all day." That wasn't my 80s. From the Grateful Dead concert through to the mid-80s, I spent my time going to concerts, going to festivals, basically soaking up a lot of what was then called the free festival scene. You had this whole scene of festivals around the country. Most of them were free, where bands would perform, people would turn up to a field, they'd camp, and this festival would go on for a few days or a week. People would hold it without permission on a piece of land, or they would hold it on a farmer's field where they'd paid the farmer. But of course, there were no health and safety rules, all of that. That scene developed over the 70s, and by the 80s, it had become huge. There was the Rainbow Fair in Norwich, there was Oxford Free Festival, went to one in Liverpool, and I went to these with a group of friends, people that I've known ever since I was 5 or 6. I kind of lived the life at that point, going to as many of those sorts of things as I could. I saw a band called Mandragora at Torpedo Town as the sun came up. The sunrise was coming up behind the stage as they were playing. During the day, I'd be working in an office, and then in the evening, I'd be going to concerts and at weekends, whenever I could fit it in. 81 to 83, my day job was as a trainee commercial executive at Westpile International in Uxbridge. I worked in the head office. I always remember the guy opposite me smoked cigars, and we had a tea lady came round in the morning with a cake trolley. Everyone wears suits and ties, and there was a real hierarchy. They basically put piles in big concrete posts into the ground to make the ground firm enough to build on. And a lot of their work was in Iraq, and I used to have to go to the Iraqi embassy to get visas for a lot of the construction workers that were going out there. So I got very familiar with visa processes, and also I dealt with carnets. Carnets are customs documents for temporary export of items. For example, we were sending pile drivers to Malaysia. These big machines were sent out there and brought back again, and I had to produce what was called a carnet, which described every part of the machine, every element of the machine, so that when the item went through customs, they could check it, and they had to ensure that it came back out of the country again, because on a temporary export, you're not permanently importing it, and what they would have been concerned about was you selling these things. So I got quite experienced in commercial documentation and customs and that side of things.
After a long week at work, Richard would pack a bag and head off on his next sonic weekend adventure.
Bunch of us got a van, one of my friends drove, and we went to Stonehenge Free Festival in 1983, and there were 30,000 people there. It's anarchic. Anything went in terms of music. You could just literally turn up, set your own stage up if you wanted to. There was no security, the police weren't on site, so it had a kind of an element of danger to it, but at the same time it was exciting because you felt you were escaping the mainstream and doing what you wanted to do. I think what appealed to people was just a connection that you got with people and the landscape. So sitting around campfires with lots of strangers for 3 or 4 days in the wilderness in many ways was like, an adventure, and all the music as well at the same time. No, if you've never done this, you've never sat sitting around a fire in the middle of nowhere looking at the stars, you haven't lived. I've just had this weird contrast of living this sort of like going to festivals thing and then coming back to an office every day. I was working at Westpile International. They went bust, so I was made redundant. I got paid, given some money, and then 83 I started at Sanderson's, working in an office doing import and export. Sanderson's was a real old school place. It was unbelievable. It was a factory that had a shop floor. It had an upper level with staff. It had executive toilets for the higher management. There was the union rep in his brown overall. Had a canteen, a social club, a bowling green. It was the last gasp of that sort of old school British industry. So I had to deal with exporting goods to Middle East, Europe, all over the place, America. But I found it fairly easy to deal with, and I could get my head around all the concepts. That's when I started to learn about VAT.
That's value added tax, or VAT, which is similar to sales tax, and it's going to play a big part in this story. The Free Festival at Stonehenge had grown so fast over the years that it was attracting more and more attention and complaints.
It was known as the Battle of the Beanfield. When it was ended, I think it's regarded as one of the most brutal pieces of policing that this country's ever seen.
By 1985, a court injunction and barbed wire had been put in place to keep festival goers away from the prehistoric Stonehenge stones. But on the 1st of June, a group of around 600 festival goers in more than 100 cars and vans headed up there. It was a very hot day. They were stopped by police roadblocks, and so they ended up stuck 7 miles away in a bean field.
And however you feel about the Free Festival at Stonehenge and all of the legalities of it, the way that people were treated was just disgusting. And I remember being really angry watching it on TV. Police in riot gear went in and just beat everybody up. People were dragged out of vehicles, smacked round the head. It was completely unwarranted. I saw somebody that went to Challengers on the TV involved in that.
A few years later, 24 people sued the police and they were awarded £24,000 for personal and property damage. The police were cleared of the accusation of wrongful arrest, though.
Because of the confrontation with the police, it started to attract the free festival scene a kind of bad element. So you went from a quite peaceful people to a bad element attracted by the fact there was friction with the police. And that's when, for me, that whole thing soured. It had just become the opposite of what it was before. It turned into a kind of us and them confrontation between the forces of the state and the perceived forces of alternative anarchy. What went was the innocence, I think. I went to Trewargy, which was kind of the end of it. Trewargy felt dangerous and out of control.
Richard started looking around for other ways to feed his interest in music. It was around this time he got first glimpse of a woman who would play a huge part in his life.
I met Julie at a party in Southampton when she was a student. She was at university with some friends of mine, and I went down there for a party with my friends. I was a bit odd at that point. I don't think she probably thought much of me at the time. When I met her, I instantly, I guess I fell in love immediately.
You've been listening to the second episode of the Corruption Diaries Season 2, hosted by me, Naomi Fowler, and produced and sound designed by Leo Schick. In the next episode...
That was really my first voyage into the music industry. It went from a hobby to a job that night.
Delerium Records music used in this episode was courtesy of Cherry Red. If you liked a song, see the track listing in the episode notes.